Welcome to CivilNet. My guest via Skype from Washington is Thomas de Waal. He is a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment, and he is one of the few specialists in the South Caucasus. Mr. de Waal, thank you for joining us.
Sure, glad to be with you.
As you know, these past 10 days, there has been an upsurge of violence and tensions and violations of the ceasefire regime on the Karabakh-Azerbaijan line of contact, and also along the international border between Armenia and Azerbaijan. You had recently written a piece called Karabakh's Guns of August, reflecting on the current situation. I want to begin today by asking you a question about the peace process. The OSCE Minsk Group Co-Chairs, in every statement they issue following an upsurge of violence or ceasefire violation, they try to always maintain neutrality or impartiality. Has this aided the process or has it distorted the peace process?
That's a great question. Well, I think the first thing to be said is that obviously most of the work the Minsk group does is behind the scenes. It's like the iceberg. We only see about 10% of it. Obviously, they've been working very hard over the last week. Both Ambassador Kasperchik, who's obviously the man on the ground, the special envoy, OSCE envoy, monitoring the ceasefire, and the three co-chairs. And I gather that the Russian co-chair will be there tomorrow at the meeting in Sochi. So obviously we don't see most of the work they do. But your question is really about the public side, and I agree with you. We don't see, in my view, enough of the public side of the Minsk group. We don't see enough details. The statements are much too general. And I do agree with you. It would be more useful if they were more detailed, more critical of if one of the parties has done something bad, if we heard about it. Obviously, that has a political risk, however, because this process, don't forget, is mainly run by the two presidents, President Aliyev and President Sargsyan. The Minsk co-chairs are just mid-level ambassadors.
I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the reactions in the region, particularly in Armenia. Dikran Mugurchyan, who is head of press, information and public relations here at the Foreign Ministry in Armenia, wrote a status on his Facebook page asking, why would Armenia instigate an attack? Because in your article you said that this could be the result of an Armenian operation or counter-operation in response to minor Azerbaijani attacks along the line of contact. He goes on to say, what military task do we have to achieve which we have not yet solved? He's talking about the Armenian side, obviously. And he asks the question, who is today continuously using the bellicose rhetoric, statements threatening war, boasting about a bloated military budget, making territorial claims on other regions of Armenia? So again, the question is that he's posing, that all of us are posing, is should the aggressor not be singled out and condemned? And again, I understand the political ramifications for the OSCE Minsk Group and for other international actors who are trying to mediate. But when you are not calling a spade, how do you expect to achieve peace?
Okay, well, first of all, let's talk a bit about what caused this latest upsurge in fighting. And maybe we should just start with reflecting on the fact that this is probably the worst fighting on the ceasefire line in 20 years. And I think one of the saddest things about this is that the young men who've been dying on both sides, many of them were actually born after the ceasefire was signed back in May 1994, which is a very sad reflection on the non-resolution of this conflict. Who started it? Often in a conflict like this, one side does something small, the other side retaliates, and it's very hard, to point the finger at who started it. As far as I understand, we've had a couple of months of Azeri attacks along the ceasefire line, particularly along the Armenian-Azerbaijani border in places like Nakhchivan, where it hasn't been seen before. And obviously these attacks, these ceasefire violations, they don't have any military logic to them. No territory is gained. It's all about scaring the other side. It's all about making a political point. And I guess maybe the last 2 months the Azerbaijanis have been challenging the status quo. We know that the status quo doesn't suit them. They're the ones who lost territory, lost the conflict. So, as you observe, it's more in their interest to challenge the ceasefire. But what happened in the last week, maybe, I think there's some evidence, we even see this from Armenian sources, that this was a kind of counter move by the Armenian side saying, and maybe the message there was enough is enough, we can also strike back, stop doing this to us. And so this could have been an act of retaliation by the Armenian side, which started it. And we've seen on pictures even of Azerbaijani positions taken by Armenians, which suggests that Armenians did cross over. So who started in the last week, hard to say, but the Armenians also maybe were trying to prove a point. Now to your second question, which is really about, should the international mediators be more specific? I think the problem is there are only 6 monitors on the ceasefire line. It's very hard to get good evidence. And so I think what's really, really badly needed now is this idea, which has been discussed for a long time, is some much more sophisticated mechanism to investigate incidents along the ceasefire line. Without that, it's going to be very hard to pinpoint exactly what's happening.
I think it's important to note for our viewers as well that this ceasefire regime has been self-maintained for the past 20 years without any peacekeepers on the ground. And I think it was in the interest of both sides, perhaps, to try and maintain that calm until there was some kind of resolution to the conflict.
There's six monitors from the OSCE who are unarmed, who make maybe visits once or twice a month to the ceasefire.
Certainly not enough to be able to investigate properly. I want to talk to you about the upcoming potential meeting between the two presidents in Sochi, as you mentioned earlier. Usually when we look back at the ceasefire violations, they always come at a time when the presidents are scheduled to meet, or when there's some action going on, or some progress or lack of progress in the peace process. Do you have any expectations from this next round?
Well, I think the first thing to be said is, as I understand it, this was a pre-scheduled meeting which initially was not going to be mainly about Karabakh. I think President Putin wanted to talk to both the presidents of Armenia and Azerbaijan, mainly about Ukraine. I think we're seeing a strong push to get them to support the Russian position on Ukraine. So I think this maybe the timing of the meeting was called forward, but this was not a meeting called at the last minute. This has been planned, I think, for some time. The other thing to say is I don't believe President Putin has a strong interest in the Karabakh peace process, unlike President Medvedev, who obviously invested a lot of time and effort. In fact, maybe the failure of President Medvedev has convinced Putin that it's not worth his effort to invest time in. However, I'm sure we will see some calls for peace, for strengthening the ceasefire, and Russia will try and use its leverage here to dampen down the fighting, because it's not in Russian interests also to have.
Well, we've heard the opposite. Speculations about Russia's involvement in perhaps instigating the conflict to then play the role of peacemaker, negotiator, mediator, in light of what's been taking place in Ukraine.
I think clearly it will be of political advantage of Russia to play the peacemaker in this case, and clearly, Russia has been supplies weapons, as we know, to both sides of the conflict. But that's not to say that Russia actually started the shooting on the ceasefire line. I don't. You can blame the Russians for giving orders to the sovereign armies of Armenia and Azerbaijan.
Okay, Mr. de Waal, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us today about this very complex, complicated, I would say tragic conflict, because today, again, there were countless ceasefire violations. We have reports of one Azerbaijani soldier being killed and an Armenian soldier being wounded, and some unconfirmed reports of other events taking place along the border. Thank you for helping us to try and understand this process a little bit more.
Sure, it is very tragic, and I think the more attention it gets, obviously, the more hope there is that this awful escalation can be de-escalated on the Karabakh line. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to remind our viewers that my guest today was Thomas de Waal. He is a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment and a specialist on the South Caucasus. Stay with CivilNet.